All right, good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for this November edition of the Leaders Cafe, a monthly series where we host conversations on key trends driving the workforce. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. As you would have noticed, last couple of months we've been looking at workplaces from the lens of women leadership. It's an area that I'm personally passionate about, and I really feel there's a lot of interesting work happening in this space. Women leadership is where we've been working with our clients, and we're working in establishing, setting, scaling, and flourishing this wonderful initiative. We've had phenomenal conversations with Anna Marinkovic from NAB on breaking barriers in corporate Australia in August. Last month, we had an interesting conversation with Kate Henaway, where she shared wonderful insights on developing effective stories into intersectional women leadership programs. Today, we are diving into a very crucial topic, which is navigating executive buy in for women leadership programs. But before we begin, here are a few stats. Men still hold 9 out of 10 CEO roles in Australia's largest companies. Around 91% of ASX 300 CEOs are men, and only 9% are women. 20 ASX 300 companies have no women in the executive leadership teams, and only 3% of culturally and racially marginalized women reported to be in senior leadership role, and only 9% were in supervisory positions. After the stats, I feel, when we get into this topic, we do have a lot of work in the space of supporting top executives in believing and working and fostering diversity, inclusivity in workplaces. Today, we'll be looking into the challenges and the strategies involved in gaining that all important executive support in women leadership initiatives. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Matthew Payne. With an impressive 2 decades of experience in human resources, cultural, organizational culture, and a strong advocate for women leadership, Matt currently serves as Executive General Manager, People and Culture at the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. His passion lies in creating workplaces that are not only productive but also safe and inclusive, especially for the advancement of women. And I have been noticing Matt all around in this space, championing diversity and inclusion, championing women leadership. And just before we got into our live session, I did invite him to share his personal story on why this matters a lot for him and making so much noise in the space. So before we commence, a quick reminder: we encourage you to drop any questions you may have in the chat. This session is designed to be interactive and we value your participation. So feel free if you agree to some points, if you have different ideas or any questions, we have 30 minutes from now. So without much ado, let's extend a virtual welcome to Matt. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here today, Sandra.
Thank you, Matt. I want to start with your story. You hold the Chief People Officer domain, the role, and there is so much that comes under it, from employee engagement to recruitment to retention to performance, productivity, etc. Why why is DEI such a big deal for you? Why do I see you championing that so much?
Hmm. For me, it really is around inclusive workplaces that then create a positive brand in the eyes of consumers and employees. And research shows that to have a diverse pool of talent also leads to a variety of perspectives, and that really helps to foster innovation, creativity, and ultimately boosting employee satisfaction and retention. And particularly in the HR world, a lot of the metrics that we use could be around satisfaction or engagement, retention, and ultimately they also lead to greater profits, and there's certainly shareholders and boards that are very interested in seeing those metrics.
Beautiful. And I know you've had this rich 2 decades of experience to actually see that happen, see that fructify in terms of results. But when we look at some data points, for example, WGEH released a data set where they say that while women make up half of employees, about 51%, only 19% of CEOs are women. Why do you feel is there a gap over there? What can be done to bridge this gap?
Mm. Yeah, it's a interesting conundrum. I think if we step it up and we think about from the global perspective, the World Economic Forum every year produce the Global Gender Gap Index, and that benchmarks the current state and the evolution of gender parity across a number of dimensions. And I just had a look at that this week, and for 2023. The number one country in the world out of 146 that they measure is Iceland. They're doing a huge amount of work there. Australia is ranked number 26, which for a developed country, I would hope that it's higher than that. And looking at India, it's 127. So there's some huge gaps there. And if things keep going, they've been doing this for about 10 years. At the current speed, it's going to take 131 years to bridge that gap. So there needs to be some quite drastic measures and initiatives put in place. And then if we think about more Australia in there is a gender pay gap in Australia of over 20%, about 22.8% to be specific. And men are twice as likely to be in the top income bracket as women. And about boards, only 1 in 5 boards have gender balance. So when I was working in the New South Wales government, there was a behavioural insights project that was completed around career progression that was in conjunction with the Public Service Commission, and it was specifically the results found that there were 4 key challenges for women with career progression, and they were that women report that there's more barriers to career progression, that women have greater caring responsibilities outside of work. Therefore, it's the woman that work or they have to sacrifice their career for child caring responsibilities. Also, women apply less frequently for roles than men, and women are more likely to doubt their skills and the chance of getting a role, meaning a male may see a job and think, yeah, well, look, I don't here, but I'm going to apply anyway. Whereas a woman from this research that we conducted was more likely to doubt their skills. So I think if you think about all that together, there's probably a number of factors that still are at play. And we hear a lot about bias and stereotypes. There may be lack of representation also of females in more senior roles in organisations. Therefore, women may not envisage themselves to be in those roles. It could be that there is a workplace culture or there's practices in place that may lead to women not wanting to do those roles. For example, if there's a really long working hours culture, if there is inflexibility of the work structure, maybe there's no hybrid working or a lack of flexible working, all of those things and those practices can really impact on the way women work. And then, of course, things like unconscious bias when it comes to recruitment and promotion. There was a study recently, actually, in Australia where it was people, and it's not just women, but those that are working remotely could be overseen or overlooked when it comes to promotions because they're not in the office. and I think that there's an overlay there. And then, other things like work-life challenges, and maybe there's even a lack of accountability inside organizations, not holding CEOs or boards to account. So there's probably a lot there, but that's what I think.
Beautiful. I'm just making notes. There's a huge laundry list on why and what is the gap there. And I know there's work happening in all of this. Sometimes it just feels it's so overwhelming. Where do we start from? What's the first step we take? With your experience and the background that you have, with the list of we're looking at recruitment,
Mm.
we're looking at productivity, looking at culture, we're looking at accountability. What would be the first step to take to start building this culture of gender equity at top?
Yeah, I think where we really need to start is thinking about the organization, whatever organization it is that our listeners are working at. And I always ask the question, does our workforce represent the community that we serve? Meaning Australia in particular is a very diverse country. And if we don't see the diversity inside the organisation and we're providing a service to the general population, something's not right. So we tend to start from a data-led approach, and it's important to understand the metrics and what is the gender breakdown. There might be some other diversity demographics that also organisations can measure and track. And then there's the intersectionality of those two. So, it may not be that it's just male and female, but then if we add on other intersections like cultural and linguistically diverse, could be an employee with a disability, could be that they identify as a different sexual orientation. So there's many different factors, but I think really understanding the data of your workforce is important, and then also really setting the roadmap of where it is that you would like to go, and what's the gap, and then thinking about some initiatives of how to bridge that gap. But I think if you don't start with some type of a benchmark, it's you need to know where you're going, but you also need to know where you're starting from.
Absolutely. You're breaking up a little bit, Matt, so I'll just quickly summarize what you're sharing is, we need to look at where the organization is, how is the organization representative of the clients, the customers they are serving, and how can we add intersections in the diversity and work from there. I think what connected deeply with me when you were sharing this is setting the roadmap first before we jump into various initiatives. You want to see what's a roadmap for me as an organization, which could be very different for another organization at the same time. And what's my why around it? Why is diversity, equity, inclusion, women leadership? Why do I need to have that and have that included in our values? I think when we talk about environment and culture of an organization,
Yeah.
it shouldn't just be a tick in the box. So it shouldn't be just because it makes uh, top line sense. That's important for a business, but it needs to go much deeper to create that sense of belongingness in an organization. And the decision makers typically of that, when you set the roadmap, are the executives, are people sitting at the board, at the C-suite level. And that brings me to the question. I know in an interview with HRM, you talked about selling diversity, equity, inclusion into the C-suite is one of the most significant challenges in this field. What do you think, or what key elements should, say, people culture leaders need to include in their business case for women leadership program to secure an executive buy-in?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, and you touched there about organizational values. So, really that there is alignment to values, that there is an alignment to the organizational goals, and emphasize how women leadership programs can align with the broader goals of the organisation. Could be around improving innovation, diversity, and market competitiveness. And also the quantifiable benefits. There's a lot of research out there that shows that a more diverse organisation has more and also will have higher profits than those that are less diverse. But I think also it's understanding the talent pipeline that you have internally and really helping to define what those success metrics are. And there's pros and cons to setting targets. I've worked in organisations that have and have not, and I'm happy to talk about that. But I think, like I've mentioned before, you really need to know where it is that you're going as an organisation and put it in. I think we can probably see the biggest change when we do have metrics that we put in place for the C-suite, the executive team. And I've seen also where they might receive their bonus could be tied to those, or their pay increases could be tied to particular metrics. And it's not just financial, but also diversity metrics.
That's interesting. And you also talked about pros and cons of setting targets. So, in your lived professional experience, what could be a target that is a pro that makes sense for organization because it drives positive culture in making this change? And what could be a target that could be a con, which you need to be careful because may not be driving? It's a target, we're moving in that direction, but it's not driving the right culture.
Yes. Okay, so I'll give you an example. When I worked in New South Wales government, the Premier of the state had set targets, particular diversity targets for all employers in the public sector. So we were working towards 50% women in senior leadership roles, and then there was some other metrics for other diversity initiatives. So I think the positive there was that there was a goal. Everybody knew where we're going, and those targets were set up to 2025. So it wasn't just an immediate overnight initiative. There were, well executed, planned approaches to a number of initiatives. But where I've seen these initiatives or targets fall down is where it's not, the why isn't explained properly, and those that don't identify in those particular demographics, then they may go for a role and feel that they didn't get the role because of their gender or because of their diversity that doesn't align to that. So I think there needs to be, real merit behind recruitment and selection, but sometimes through initiatives, particular programs of work, they can certainly help to develop people. So an example that I worked with in government was we had a few different initiatives. One was the Women in Senior Leadership Mentoring Program. It was a specific program only aimed at women who had high potential to move into a leadership role. And they were mentored by another executive who had already reached that goal, who was already working at that level. And it was a 12-month program, and it was extremely popular. We always had so many people that wanted to be on it because they saw that there was real tangible outcomes. And it wasn't that they were favoured, but they, through their mentoring relationships and also the education that they received, it really helped to shape them to then, on their own merit, when they went for a role, that they felt comfortable and were able to achieve the selection criteria. And another program that we ran was the Open Doors program, and that was a career sponsorship program. So the difference between mentoring and sponsorship is mentoring is more about being available and assisting and helping to mentor and coach, whereas the sponsorship program was opening doors but very senior executives who were then able to use their own connections to then open doors and connections to those people who were then able to grow and to develop and to really benefit from that and leverage those executives' senior leadership roles. So we certainly had great success with both of those programs, and we're able to see some really demonstrable outcomes.
Oh, those are great programs you talked about. And we keep talking about there may be enough mentorship. Maybe women are over mentored, but they're under sponsored. So happy to hear you talk about the Open Door program because there are a lot of opportunities for women to upskill. But I think the biggest support that women leaders need at that is to have somebody open the door, use the network, and get them the position that they deserve. I what about skill building, Matt? What do you feel? Do we need a separate program for women leaders for them to skill build to reach those positions?
Well, the success that we had with the Women in Senior Leadership program was also that there was particular every couple of months there would be a skills development program aimed at that cohort of women that were on the program. So um, I think there was definitely some great merit in that, where women were able to come along and discuss some of the issues that they may be facing and hear from other women about how they're overcoming that, or in the groups that they've been allocated with their trainer, that they can unpack that. Um, and some of it could be, purely down to their own confidence, and other things might be around skills. But I have seen the particular programs aimed at women that have had great outcomes. Having said that, I've also seen other programs where it's mixed genders and there's also great outcomes.
Mhm.
So I think it will probably depend on the content of those skills programs, but I'm
Mhm.
certainly not adverse to them.
Yeah, yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, often we are asked why do we need to have a separate women leadership program and why not a mixed gender? And you're right, there is merit for both, but I also feel they're very unique challenges that women professionals go through, which you listed out beautifully earlier in our talk, whether it's caring responsibilities, it's doubt, imposter syndrome, which sometimes are uniquely higher for that gender, and therefore having a program in exclusively to take care of those challenges helps in managing and also creating a safe space for them to feel we are not in it alone. There are other women professionals going through this challenge, and there's a
Mm,
sense of community that's created for us to move ahead. Um, what I wanted to talk about, and you shared some very interesting initiatives that you've run, especially with the NSW government in terms of targets
mm.
um, and 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 the initiatives you put for women leadership. What what can we do where maybe you don't have an organization that has a very strong executive buy-in for women leadership? Let's take an example. Organization is already profitable, doing really well, but there is very little gender balance in the leadership, in the leadership executive C-suite, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
How can we showcase the return on investment on women leadership to them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think particularly these days, we're seeing more and more media for, and not always positive, sometimes negative media, where there are organisations that don't have good gender balance or don't have good diversity, particularly as they go higher. And especially in Australia, from next year, 2024, the Workplace Gender Equality Agency will be publicly publishing the gender pay gap of every organisation, not government, but all private organisations with more than 100 employees. And whilst there's probably some of those organisations that do have only males at the top, and there could be females that are at more junior levels, that will just showcase even more the gap between the genders, the pay gap, I should say, between the genders. So there's a real business benefit of making sure that organisations are, uh, first of all, measuring what the pay gap is, but then analysing their data and looking at what they can do, because I have absolutely no doubt that from next year there will be quite a few media articles that will come out that won't be positive in a variety of different organisations in Australia. But I think also then it just goes back to thinking about, in Australia in particular as well, actually, no, not just Australia, but globally, there's an aging population. So women's economic workforce participation is becoming more and more important around the world. The more women that are working and particularly moving into more senior roles, the bigger the impact it is for the economy of the country that they're in, the more tax they pay. Those taxes then have benefits for the whole country. So there's real equity measures there, and outside of that, it's just the right thing to do. So I think from an ethical perspective, organisations these days have got a lot of measures around ethics and sustainability, and gender balance, particularly in senior roles, should be on everyone's agenda.
What I love about my questions with you, Matt, is you've got solid data points before you start any statements. I mean, it just takes away, should I, shouldn't I? It's like right on your face, these are your numbers, this is your biggest threat. You don't want to do it next year, your names will be published. So it just makes complete business sense to do it.
Mm.
Um, we just, take some
And there's probably there's some countries already that are publishing this type of data. Australia's, it's coming next year, but
Mhm.
there's already business cases out there as to that there should be more diversity.
Uh, while we have this coming next year, which is working around the workplace gender balance, in today's economic conditions and with so-called economic slowdown, organizations now are holding on to their budgets. Uh, what's your take on the future of women leadership landscape in this environment, in this mind space?
Mm. Well, look, I guess thinking about reputation and brand, and that can have a huge impact on budgets as well as turnover. And there could be, through a lack of diversity in leadership, can also lead to missed business opportunities. I know a lot of the consulting firms these days, when they go out and they are targeting business projects, they do all of this analysis before they then go off and select the organisation that they might want to work with. So there's potential of lost business there. It could be a limited talent pooling, or the brand and the reputation of the organisation. If it's very male centric, it may be that women just don't want to go and work there, and that's becoming more and more popular in Australia, where the employee makes a choice as to where they would like to work, and so they should. And if they're not seeing the diversity or the ethics or the values that they adhere to personally, then they just won't go there. So that's going to have an impact also on profitability.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, ultimately, shareholders, particularly for the public listed companies, a shareholder expects to see not just that an organisation is producing results and profits, but more and more we're seeing shareholders wanting to see the ethical components as well that are upheld by the boards and the CEOs of organisations.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, it makes sense because you're looking at a whole rounded organization that not just looking at profits, but looking at the culture that's creating in the future as well. What's the threat if we just continue unidirectional? So we did talk a lot about that in this, and thank you for sharing such rich insights on initiatives being done for women leaders, how to create that space, how do you get executive buy-in with data. Do you feel that it's only on, say, the chief people officers or learning and development departments to create that buy-in? Can anyone else in the organization, and how can they create that buy-in, that noise, that with executives to make this happen?
That's a great question. Look, it shouldn't be led just by HR or L&D. I mean, these are organisational initiatives, and ideally they should be sponsored at the executive level. So where I've seen the biggest impact in these areas is when an organisation decides to go down this track, and they might launch, for example, a diversity, inclusion and belonging strategy. And within that, there might be multiple silos or segments of diversity that they would like to work on. So there could be, for example, demographics of women in senior leadership, which is the topic for today. It could be people with disability. It might be LGBTIQA plus inclusion, could be other things. But then it's not just about having a plan on a page. It's to bring it to life. I would suggest that there are executive sponsors for each of those. And then within that, that it's also brought to life through the employees, through what we call an employee resource group. So, for example, there could be a gender, a women's employee resource group. There might be a people with disability. There could be other cohorts, but those groups get together. And it's not just about social connection, but it's also thinking about, from an organisational perspective, what can they do better? What's their feedback? Are there policies or procedures that are getting in the way for workforce participation? Are there things that are a hamper to the workforce? What are other metrics? If the organisation is doing surveys, what's the feedback from those groups? Being able to break down the survey responses by demographic. So ideally, I would see that there is executive sponsorship, employee resource groups, and an action plan that is then regularly communicated back out to the organisation, and that the CEO is involved, or the most senior person in the organisation is involved in that as well.
When you shared this, there's a story that came up for me when you talked about employee resource groups, especially women. And this happened around COVID when, budgets were shut down, organizations were not investing in training investment. So there's a client of ours, an organization didn't have budget at that time and was severely hit by COVID shutdown at that time. But they had a women resource group who got together. So there were women professionals just got together in the organization. They would fix these meetings, and they would actually reach out to industry leaders, facilitators, coaches, and create this once a month forum where they'll invite a coach on a special topic, and they ran the women leadership program with zero
Right.
budget. Yeah, so that's a great example of when you talked about women resource, how they kind of gather resources and get that done.
Yeah, totally. And I've seen that those grassroots initiatives where it's not actually led by the organisation, it's led by the members of the group, can sometimes have even greater cut through.
Deeper impact. I agree. I agree.
Mm.
I'm seeing a lot of questions here, so I'm going to jump right into the questions, especially if there's a question that resonates, the one that I had for you. So I'm going to go to Amita's question. Can you share a comparative view of how the public sector and private sector varies in gender representation in Australia? I think one of the past speakers mentioned that the public sector needs to up its game and has things to learn from some positive initiatives undertaken by corporate sector. Your thoughts, please.
Mm. Good question. Look, I guess, first of all, I don't have the data breakdown in front of me, so I wouldn't be able to answer exactly the specifics. But what I can say is there was a few initiatives that were run in Australia that really helped to increase participation, particularly of women in the private sector. and that was the Male Champions of Change program, which you may have heard of. And that program really was a call out to particularly male sponsors and male CEOs, and looking at how they can make organisational change that would then lead to greater female representation. And the view through that initiative, which is still going, and maybe it's not as popular as what it was, but certainly still going. There was a very large increase of women participation, but equally in the public sector, which is where I also had experience, particularly New South Wales, when the Premier set targets for 50% women in senior leadership, it really helped myself, particularly as a Chief People Officer and in the role that I was in, the Executive Director role also that I held, to be able to hold leaders to account, and to say, right, every month we would measure where we're at with our participation. We're able to look at the gap. We're able to then come up with some really meaningful programs and regularly report that data and how we're increasing that data to the executive team through a monthly pack of data and metrics. And that visibility at the senior level really helped everyone to have buy-in. And, I think it makes, in some cases, it might make it easier when you've got that real push, particularly when we're getting close to achieving that. So I think, and where you've got leaders, most leaders, it doesn't matter what industry, private or public, would want to achieve targets. So there's that old saying, what gets measured gets done, or variations of it, but I think that helps.
Yeah, that's a brilliant example of how you get executive buy-in. Is you have a target come from an executive or come from the top, and you actually measure it and continue in that direction. Yeah, and what gets measured gets seen as well.
That's right.
Yeah, if you don't measure
That's
it, you
right.
don't see it. And even if things are being done, you don't see it because there's no
Yes,
measure. That's
that's right. Probably one more thing on that topic. It was important for us as well to really highlight and demonstrate particular days of significance in the calendar year. So International Women's Day is one that comes to mind. And on International Women's Day every year, we would hold an event. It was for all genders, not just women, but we would highlight and we'd have normally a panel of female leaders, successful female leaders, that would talk about their leadership journey, their struggles, how it is that they might be able to juggle work with family, and any other things that they might want to talk about, and really showcase their story, because then other female leaders and other females can aspire and learn from those. So having those real life stories and bringing those days of significance to life, I think I find that helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go to the next question from Luan. What role do emerging women leaders play in achieving gender diversity?
I think that everyone has a part to play in this, and those that have succeeded and got already achieved those female leadership roles, they should also be helping the pipeline of talent behind them. Because, and I see this, and it's not just in female leadership, but all levels of diversity, that if everyone helps to pave that journey forward, it's going to make it easier and more acceptable for those who are still aspiring to go through that journey. So for them to be able to use their experience, maybe talk about, what worked well for them, what didn't work well, being a mentor, and being available to coach other people that might want to aspire. Everyone has a part to play, and hopefully they can use their own experience to help others.
Yeah. I would add one more bit to that, because these are emerging women leaders, they're not up there. or they will be there soon. I would say, being able to push through. And at least the last point that you talked about, the doubt. Yes, you could be a
Mm.
kid. That could be real. There, that is a real challenge. But overcoming that doubt, the imposter syndrome, asking for help, asking for the door to open doors. I think those are some roles that we can play as emerging women leaders to actually claim that seat as well.
Yeah, and I guess if I'm thinking about from the emerging angle, it could also be that you're knocking on doors of those above you to ask for guidance, to express your desire of wanting to move up the ladder. So, I find that that can also help.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's linked to the next question. From your experience, Matthew, what are some of the top three skills that women professionals can build or work towards to becoming a strong contender for the top position?
Oh, that's a hard one. There's so many amazing skills
So
that are
many
out
options.
there. Look, I always say to anybody, if they would like to move up the ladder, it's thinking about their curiosity, their innovation, but also going for a more senior role is not just about technical skills. It's about people leadership, and it's about relationships, negotiation. It's about how to navigate difficult decisions. So it's focusing on what's probably traditionally called maybe those more softer skills,
Mhm.
because it's not just about the hard skill of doing a job. Leaders have to be able to really have that emotional intelligence to be
Mhm.
able to deal with many different scenarios. So having that level of skill is important. But I think, look, it probably also depends on the role that they're going for. But certainly, people leadership, I'd be looking, if someone's going for a leadership position, ideally that they've done some type of other mentoring, coaching, or leadership. It could be in an external voluntary role, or it might be something else.
Mhm. Yeah. I was looking at when you talked about EI, I'm looking at EIA, which is having emotional intelligence and action. Sometimes we
Mm.
have a lot of emotional intelligence, we know what's happening, but the action gets missed. And that's where true change comes, and that's where we drive that change is to experiment. Failure is not shouldn't be a roadblocker, but just to try more aspects, more doors. One door closes, how do we open the next door?
Yeah, that's right. And you mentioned before about imposter syndrome, and I think like that's common for many people,
Mhm.
thinking that they may not think of themselves as the best person for the role, or that they've got to the role and that they're doubting their own skills and experience. And
Mhm.
I think it is normal, but having not letting it become so debilitating that you can't actually then perform in the role and action.
Yeah, yeah. In this section, I do want to share my own personal take on imposter syndrome because I had a lot of imposter syndrome. There were many opportunities I didn't raise my hand early in my career, missed a lot of opportunities there. They're funny stories now, but they weren't at that time when I missed it. But this is what I tell myself to overcome imposter syndrome is saying that there is no role ever I'll be perfect for, especially in this uncertain environment that we are working and the uncertain world that we are in. We will never be perfect in any role because you don't have control of what happens externally. So, knowing that and then jumping into that situation, raising your hand for that opportunity is the best thing you can do for yourself and for the role that you're taking. And that's my little tip on how I overcame and still do at many opportunities to overcome imposter syndrome. So let's move on to the last question before we wrap up. We have a minute to go. I'm going to take Avinash's question. He's asking, are there unique considerations or challenges in gaining executive buy-in for women leadership in a global context, and how can these be addressed?
Yeah, it's a deep question, and I think definitely in a global context, there are unique circumstances, and that would come down to the cultural elements of that country. If I talk about it from my experience in the Western world, certainly in Australia, I've worked in roles that also cover New Zealand and the UK. I worked in London for 8 years. I think these days it's definitely more and more accepted, and it's not just accepted, it's actually expected that organisations have that cultural and gender diversity. But having said that, there's countries that are still out there in the world that have got a long way to go. So, I can't probably comment so much about those countries, but certainly being able to focus on the ones and the initiatives that work is something that I would focus and probably just express that yes, in some countries there's a long way to go, but I'm hoping that it won't take that 131 years that what I mentioned at the start with the World Economic Forum data.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I believe that's a good start point. And what you shared so far in a call, it's a call for action in any country. You talk about results, you talk about innovation, creativity, bias, etc. It's common. But I think the cultural aspect, if we have storytelling that's associated with it, which is unique to your culture, showcasing those stories, those case studies, I think that creates that uniqueness in each culture and add the global perspective to this bit.
Hmm.
Super, super. This has been such a rich conversation, Matt. 45 minutes just flew by.
I know.
I've got a lot of data points from you in our conversation. But the big ones that stand out for me is, to gain executive buy-in, firstly, get your case study right. Know that there is enough proof out there that it works. It's good for the business, it's good for the organization, it's good for the community, and good for the country. Just take the data out there, start simple, start small. You don't need to make it too complicated. Have some targets around it, because if you don't measure it, you don't see it. Simple as that. And yeah, and make it unique for you and find what your roadmap is and move in that direction. Thank you, Matt, for these rich insights for our team. And thank you, everyone who's been listening and will be seeing the recording as well. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being there. We'll be back next month for another interesting topic. Get ready for the holidays and enjoy the next few weeks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, everybody.